I was at the bank, resolving what I thought was my last attempt to salvage something from my shattered life, when the manager closed the office door and looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Was it pity? Was it discomfort? My heart was so accustomed to rejection that I didn't even care. I'd come here to try to negotiate the debts my ex-husband and ex-best friend had left in my name before they ran off together. Yes, you heard right. My husband of 23 years had run off with my childhood best friend, and as if that weren't humiliation enough, they'd managed to put loans, credit cards, and mortgages in my name. There I was, 47 years old, homeless, broke, and without dignity, trying to explain to this woman that I needed more time to pay off debts that weren't even mine. That's when she opened a manila envelope, slid a document across the table, and said something that made my world stop spinning. Ms. Thompson, I need to inform you that there is a checking account in your name at this bank that was opened 28 years ago and has never been used. The current balance is $95,500,000. If you're listening to me now, you probably know that life has those twists and turns that seem like a movie script, but actually happen to real people. Here on this channel, you'll find stories like mine, true accounts of people who went through hell and managed to find a way out. They're stories of overcoming, pain, betrayal, but also of new beginnings and justice. Subscribe to the channel and come be part of this community where we support each other, understand each other, and share experiences that make us stronger. Because at the end of the day, we all have our battles, and knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. Now let me tell you from the beginning, how I arrived at that bank thinking I was at rock bottom, never imagining that my life was about to change completely. My name is Ellen Thompson, and for 23 years, I was the perfect wife. I woke up at 5 in the morning to make my husband, Richard, coffee before he left for work. I kept the house spotless, tended the garden, prepared elaborate dinners, and organized gatherings with friends and family. Richard was a manager at a car dealership in Boston, and I had left my career as a literature professor when we married because he said he wanted a homemaker. At the time, I thought it was romantic. I thought I was building a solid family, an old-fashioned marriage with clearly defined roles. What an idiot I was. My best friend since I was 13, Patricia, was practically family. She had dinner at our house at least twice a week. She spent holidays with us. When she divorced her abusive husband 3 years ago, I was the one who took her in, who paid for her lawyer, who stayed up nights while she cried on my couch. I gave her $5,000 of my savings so she could rent an apartment. Patricia always said that I was the sister she never had, that our friendship was sacred, that she would be eternally grateful. Everything began to fall apart on a Tuesday in March. I had gone to the supermarket to do my weekly shopping when I received a call from the bank informing me that my credit card had been declined. I was confused because Richard always said our finances were fine. He took care of everything, paid all the bills, and I never questioned it. After all, I trusted him completely. I called Richard, but he didn't answer. I sent a message, and he responded hours later, saying it must be a system error and that he would fix it. But the next day it happened again. And the day after that too. I started to get worried. That's when I decided to go to the bank in person to understand what was happening. The manager greeted me with a serious expression and showed me statements that left me breathless. Our joint account was empty. Not just empty, it was overdrawn by $12,000. On top of that, there were 3 credit cards in my name that I didn't even know existed, all maxed out. The total debt was $48,000. I left the bank in shock. How had this happened? Richard had access to all my documents, signed things on my behalf because I trusted him, but this? I went straight to the dealership where he worked. The receptionist told me Richard had quit 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks and he hadn't told me anything. I called his cell phone repeatedly until he finally answered. Ellen, we need to talk. I'm at Patricia's apartment. Can you come over? My stomach churned. Why would he be at my best friend's apartment in the middle of the day? I drove there, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When Patricia opened the door, she couldn't look me in the eye. Richard was sitting on her couch, the same couch where she had cried so many times while I comforted her. He didn't even get up when I walked in. He just said with a coldness I hadn't heard before that our marriage was over, that he was in love with Patricia, that they had been together for 8 months, and that I needed to accept the situation like a mature woman. 8 months. They had had sex on my couch. They had laughed at me behind my back. They had planned this betrayal while I served them dinner at my table. I was paralyzed for a few seconds before I could speak. What about the debts? What about the $48,000 in my name? Richard sighed as if I were being inconvenient. Ellen, you need to understand that Patricia and I needed money to start our life together. You have the house. You can sell it and pay off these debts. The house. The house I inherited from my mother when she died 6 years ago? The house I had put in both our names when we got married because Richard said it was more romantic, that it would show I trusted him? Patricia finally spoke, in that tearful voice I knew so well. Ellen, I'm so sorry, but Richard makes me happy in a way you could never understand. You've been roommates for years. He deserves a woman who truly desires him. I left that apartment without screaming, without crying, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. But when I got to my car, I broke down. I cried until I had no more tears. Then I went home, our home, and started gathering the documents I would need. That's when I discovered the situation was even worse than I imagined. Richard had refinanced the house 3 months ago without telling me and had withdrawn $90,000 of equity that had been tied up. The money was gone. He had also taken out personal loans using the house as collateral. In total, the house my mother had left me, which was fully paid off, now had $150,000 of debt tied to it. I called a lawyer immediately. What he told me was devastating. Since the house was in both our names, and Richard had the power of attorney I had given him years ago to facilitate paperwork, technically he had the legal right to make those transactions. Suing would take years, and I probably wouldn't recover even half of what I had lost. The next few days were a blur of humiliation. Richard returned to the house with Patricia to get his things. They didn't even try to hide their closeness. Patricia wore a blouse I'd given her for her birthday. Richard hummed as he packed his clothes. They laughed at inside jokes I didn't understand. At one point, I heard Patricia whisper to him that she couldn't stand pretending to like me anymore, that it had been torturous having to have dinner at that house every week listening to my boring stories. Richard replied that they would soon be free, that they could soon live openly without having to put up with the proper woman who didn't know how to have fun. They thought I wasn't listening. I choked back tears and stayed silent in my room until they left. When the door closed, I looked around the empty house and wondered how my life had gotten to this point. The following weeks were the worst of my life. I put the house up for sale, but the market was bad, and with all that debt tied up in the property, no one wanted to buy. The banks started calling me daily to charge my credit cards. I tried to explain that it was fraud, that my husband had done it, but they didn't care. My name was on my social security number. I was responsible. I had to start working 2 jobs to even pay the interest. During the day, I worked in a coffee shop, and at night, I cleaned offices. At 47, I was scrubbing bathrooms from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. My back ached, my hands became rough, and my face aged 10 years in 3 months. But the worst was the pitying looks people had. Old neighbors would see me waiting tables in the coffee shop and whisper to each other. I could hear the comments. Poor Ellen, her husband left her for a younger woman and even took all the money. She was always so naive, always wanting to believe in the fairy tale. Patricia and Richard didn't hide their relationship. On the contrary, they wanted everyone to know. They posted photos on social media, went to restaurants where our mutual friends frequented, and talked openly about how they'd fallen in love and how true love couldn't be denied. Some people I considered friends began avoiding me. It was as if I were contagious, as if my misfortune could rub off on them if they stayed around me too long. Others came with that false solidarity that was worse than contempt. Ellen, you need to move on. You'll find someone better. At least you found out now and didn't waste any more time. As if 23 years of my life were just wasted time. As if it were easy to move on when you're drowning in debt, working 16 hours a day just to survive, and watching the man you loved and the woman you considered a sister build their dream lives with the money they stole from you. 4 months after the separation, I received the divorce notice. Richard wanted half of everything. Half of what? He had taken everything. But his lawyer argued that the house was still in their name and that he was entitled to half the value, even with all the debts. It was at that moment that I truly understood the depth of his cruelty. He wasn't just happy to have betrayed, robbed, and humiliated me. He wanted to destroy me completely. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Richard and Patricia appeared together at the hearing, hand in hand, as if they were doing humanity a favor by showing that true love exists. Patricia had lost weight, had Botox, and was wearing expensive clothes that had surely been bought with money that should have been mine. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. It was as if she had won a competition I hadn't even known was happening. The judge ruled that the house would be sold and the proceeds divided after all debts were paid. In the end, there would be perhaps $20,000 left to be divided between us. $10,000. It was all I had left of a lifetime of dedication and sacrifice. The house sold 3 months later for below market value because I urgently needed the money. After paying off all debts and fees, I had exactly $11,400 left. Richard received the same amount. He spent it all on a 2-week cruise with Patricia to the Caribbean. I saw the photos on Instagram. They posted colorful drinks, romantic sunsets, happy selfies with hashtags about true love and new beginnings. Meanwhile, I used my $11,000 to rent a room in a boarding house on the poor side of town. It wasn't even an apartment. It was a 3-by-4-meter room with a bed, a dresser, and a shared bathroom in the hallway. My neighbors were immigrant workers, young addicts trying to recover, and elderly people abandoned by their families. I had become one of those people society prefers not to see. A 48-year-old woman with no family, no money, no future. A failure. The friends I still keep in touch with, which were few, began giving me unsolicited advice. You need to forgive to move on, Ellen. Holding a grudge only hurts you. But how could I forgive when I saw Patricia and Richard living the best phase of their lives at my expense? They had announced their engagement 4 months after the divorce was finalized. A $5,000 ring, something else bought with money stolen from me. The wedding would be on Martha's Vineyard, in an intimate ceremony for 50 guests. Intimate. 50 people to celebrate a relationship that began with betrayal and theft. I received an email from a mutual ex-friend telling me the details. She thought I wanted to know, or maybe she just wanted to see my reaction. Apparently everyone was talking about what a perfect couple Richard and Patricia were, how they complemented each other, how beautiful it was to see 2 people so in love. No one mentioned that love had cost me everything. It was around this time that I started having panic attacks. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, in a cold sweat, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. I couldn't afford therapy, so I tried to cope alone. I would work, go home, sleep, wake up, and repeat it all over again. I stopped looking in the mirror because I didn't recognize the woman I saw. My hair was gray and lifeless. My skin was blotchy and deeply wrinkled. My eyes were dull. I had become a shadow. People in the coffee shop barely noticed me. I was just another tired waitress serving coffee and listening to complaints about wrong orders. At my cleaning job, I was invisible. The executives worked late, and I cleaned around them like a ghost. They continued their meetings, their important calls, their million-dollar negotiations, while I emptied their trash cans and mopped the floors. No one said good morning. No one said thank you. I simply didn't exist. 6 months after the divorce, I received an invitation to Richard and Patricia's wedding. Yes, you heard right. They had the audacity to send me an invitation. The accompanying message said they hoped I would be mature enough to move on from the past and celebrate their love. That they held no grudges and hoped I wouldn't either. That it would be nice to have all their close friends present on this special day. I read it 3 times, trying to figure out if it was a cruel joke or if they truly believed it. I decided not to go, obviously, but the date stuck in my mind. On their wedding day, a beautiful Saturday in September, I was cleaning the bathroom of a law firm in downtown Boston. It was 7 o'clock in the evening, and I imagined Patricia walking down the aisle in an expensive dress, Richard waiting at the altar, all the guests commenting on what a beautiful couple they were. Meanwhile, I was on my knees scrubbing stains from the toilet. I cried there, on the cold floor of that bathroom, finally allowing all the pain I'd held in for months to come out. The following months were a grey haze. I continued working, paying the rent on my miserable little room, surviving on the bare minimum. I ate mostly instant noodles and cheap sandwiches. I lost 12 kilos not by choice, but by necessity. I had no money for anything else. Once a week, I allowed myself to buy a real coffee, not the watery one they made at the cafe where I worked, but a cappuccino from a good cafe. It was $4.50, which I probably shouldn't have spent, but it was the only thing that made me feel remotely human. I'd sit on a bench in the square, sip my coffee slowly, and pretend for 20 minutes that my life wasn't a complete disaster. It was during one of these afternoons that I saw Richard and Patricia for the first time since their wedding. They were leaving an expensive restaurant across the street, laughing loudly, she wearing a fur coat, he wearing a new watch that glinted in the sun. They didn't see me, thank God, but I watched them. I noticed how carefree they were, how light they seemed, how betrayal and theft weighed on their consciences. Something broke inside me that day. It wasn't anger, though it was there. It was a deep resignation, an acceptance that this was my life now. I was the loser, the rejected one, the woman who wasn't smart enough to see the betrayal coming. And they were the winners, the ones who had the courage to go after what they wanted, no matter who they destroyed along the way. Society celebrated them as a loving couple who had overcome obstacles to be together. I was merely an obstacle that had been overcome. I returned to my small room that night and found an envelope that had been slipped under the door. It was an eviction notice. I was 3 days behind on my rent, and the landlord wasn't known for his patience. I had until the end of the month to pay the $750 I owed, or I would have to move out. I checked my bank account. He had $412. My paycheck wouldn't come in for 2 weeks. I quickly did the math. Even working overtime at both jobs, I wouldn't be able to save enough money in time. I spent the next week in silent desperation. I asked the few people who still spoke to me if they could lend me money. They all had excuses. Hard times, bills to pay, they can't help now, but maybe next month. I tried to request a salary advance at both jobs. I was denied. I looked for cheaper rooms to rent, but everything required a first month's payment, a last month's payment, and a security deposit. Money I didn't have. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly without options. I saw the real possibility of being homeless, of becoming one of the women I saw sleeping in cardboard boxes near the train station. That could easily have been me. And maybe I deserved to be. Maybe this was the natural consequence of having been so naive, so stupid, so pathetic. The night before the rent was due, I sat on my narrow bed and seriously considered giving up on everything. I won't go into detail about the dark thoughts I had, but they were there, insistent, telling me it would be easier to just stop fighting. It was precisely in that moment of utter despair that I remembered something. Years ago, when my mother was ill in the last months of her life, she had given me a box filled with important documents. Her birth certificate, her will, the deed to the house, that sort of thing. I had kept that box without ever really looking at its contents. After all, Richard handled everything related to documents and finances. But I had never shown him this box. It was stored in the basement storage room of the boarding house where I lived, along with the few things left from my previous life. I went down there that night, rummaging through dusty boxes until I found the old shoebox where my mother had put the papers. I sat on the cold basement floor and began rummaging through it. The will, which I already knew. Old photos. Certificates. And then, at the bottom, a yellowed envelope that said bank account and important information. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was an old bank card, so old the plastic was brittle. First National Bank of Boston. A bank that no longer existed, bought by a larger bank many years ago. Along with the card was a handwritten letter from my mother. The letter said this: "My dear Ellen, if you're reading this, it's been years since we said goodbye. There's an account I opened for you when you were 19, just after you started college. Your grandmother had left me a small inheritance, and I decided that half of that money would be yours, but only when you really needed it. I put $50,000 in that account and instructed the bank not to send me statements, not to allow withdrawals, just to let the money grow with compound interest until you needed it one day. I never told you about this because I wanted you to build your life on your own, but I also wanted you to have a safety net in case something terrible happened. The account number and all the information are in this envelope. Use this money wisely when you need it. I love you forever, your mother." I read that 5 times in a row. $50,000. My mother had saved $50,000 for me almost 30 years ago, and I had no idea. How was this possible? How had the bank never contacted me? But then I realized the original bank no longer existed, had been absorbed, and my registration data was probably lost in some old system. The account existed but was forgotten, inactive, waiting for someone to claim it. The next morning, before work, I went to the branch of the bank that had absorbed First National Bank decades ago. It was a grey Tuesday in October, and I was exhausted, having not slept well, but also with a glimmer of hope for the first time in a year. I explained the situation to the receptionist, showed her the documents, the old card, the letter from my mother. She looked at me skeptically, saying that accounts so old were complicated, that I would have to speak to a manager, that there was probably nothing there. She made me wait 40 minutes. When the manager finally called me, a woman in her 50s named Jennifer, I explained everything again. She took the documents, typed a few things into the computer, frowned, typed more, and then asked me to wait a moment. She left the room for about 10 minutes that felt like hours. When she returned, she closed the door behind her and sat down with a serious expression. "Ms. Thompson," she said, "I need to ask you a few questions to verify your identity before we proceed." I answered everything she asked. My mother's maiden name, date of birth, old address, everything. Jennifer typed a few more things and then looked me straight in the eye. "Mrs. Thompson," she said slowly, "there is indeed an account in your name that was opened in 1997. The initial account was $50,000, as indicated in the documents you brought. The account remained dormant all these years, with no withdrawals or additional deposits. Due to bank policy at the time, the account was set to accrue compound interest annually, starting at a rate of 7% that was adjusted over the years according to the market." She paused, and I felt my heart race. How much was there? 10,000? 20,000? Any amount would be a miracle at that moment. "With compound interest over 28 years, Jennifer continued, "and considering the account has never been touched and the interest has always been reinvested, the current balance is $95,557,842. The world stopped. My brain simply couldn't process the number. 95 million? That was impossible. It had to be a mistake. "I typed it wrong," I said, my voice sounding strange. "Are you sure it's not 95,000? Jennifer shook her head. "No, ma'am. 95 million. What happened was an administrative error when the original bank was absorbed. Your account was accidentally categorized as a high-yield corporate investment account instead of a personal savings account. 4 years, it was managed by our best investors as if it were a corporate account, investing in high-yield funds, stocks, bonds, and real estate. The returns were extraordinary, especially during market booms. And because the account was dormant and had no activity, it simply continued to grow without anyone questioning it. I sat in that chair, unable to move. $95 million. My life had been destroyed because of less than $200,000 in debt. I had spent a year in hell, working 16 hours a day, living in a miserable room, eating instant noodles, thinking about giving up. And all the while, there was $95 million waiting for me. The irony was so absurd that I started laughing. Not a happy laugh, but a hysterical, can-do-it-all laugh. Jennifer looked at me with concern, offered me water, Asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I was having a revelation of cosmic proportions about how insane, random, cruel, and sometimes miraculously generous life was. Jennifer explained that the bank was aware of the administrative error and that I had every legal right to that money. She gave me forms to sign, the numbers of wealth management lawyers, and contact cards for financial advisors. She said the money could be transferred to a new account in my name within 72 hours, after some routine legal checks. I left that bank in shock. I didn't go back to work. I couldn't. I walked the streets of Boston for hours, trying to process what had just happened. $95 million. I was rich. Not just rich. I was absurdly, obscenely rich. Rich enough to never have to work again. Rich enough to buy anything I wanted. Rich enough to make Richard and Patricia look pitiful in comparison. And that's when the anger came. A burning, cleansing, justified anger. All those months of humiliation, pain, and despair had been unnecessary. I had gone through all that while millions were waiting for me. Richard and Patricia had destroyed me for so little. They had stolen perhaps $200,000 in total between the house and debts. I had 477 times more than that. They had no idea. No one had any idea. And now I had choices for the first time in a year. Choices about what to do, where to live, how to live. But more importantly, choices about how to deal with the people who had walked all over me when they thought I was worthless. First, I went to the boarding house where I was living and paid not only the back rent but 6 months in advance, in cash, using the limit on my still valid credit card. The landlord was so surprised he could barely speak. Then I went to a decent hotel, not the most expensive in town because I was still processing everything, but a clean place with a comfortable room, and paid for a week. I took the longest shower of my life, cried in the hot shower until I had no tears left, and then slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, reality had set in. I was rich. I had power. I had options. And I was going to use all of them as wisely as possible. I called one of the lawyers Jennifer had recommended. I scheduled meetings with financial advisors. I began planning not only my future, but my revenge. Because I had learned something important during that horrible year. The world respects money. The world respects power. And I finally had both. I spent the next 3 days in endless meetings. Lawyers explained to me how to protect my assets, how to create trusts, how to invest conservatively to ensure my money would last for generations. Financial advisors showed me portfolios, investment options, and growth strategies. I absorbed it all like a sponge. When the money was officially transferred to my new account, I looked at the balance on the bank app and had to sit down. $95,557,842. Real. Definite. Mine. The first thing I did was quit both jobs. I didn't give notice. I didn't explain anything. I simply called and said I wouldn't be back. The coffee shop manager was furious, saying I was letting them down, that it was irresponsible. I simply hung up in the middle of her tirade. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what anyone thought of me. The second thing I did was rent a beautiful apartment in Back Bay, overlooking the Charles River, with 3 bedrooms, a gourmet kitchen, marble bathrooms, everything I'd never had. I bought furniture, new clothes, scheduled spa treatments, and went to the dentist to fix the teeth I'd neglected. I began to take care of myself, to rebuild the woman who had been destroyed. But all of this was just preparation. The real question was what to do about Richard and Patricia. My lawyer told me I could sue them for the money they'd stolen. But lawsuits were public, time-consuming, and I'd have to prove every fraudulent transaction. Besides, they no longer had the money. They'd already spent it all on trips, clothes, and the wedding. Even if I won, I probably wouldn't get any of it back. No, I wanted something different. I wanted them to know. I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd lost when they discarded me. I wanted them to see the woman they'd considered a failure become everything they'd never be. I started slowly. I posted a few photos on social media. Nothing obvious. A photo in my new apartment, framed to show off the huge windows and the view. A photo with shopping bags from expensive stores, captioned simply with a heart emoji. A selfie at the spa, with a relaxed and happy face, captioned, "Finding peace and self-care." People started commenting. Old friends who'd abandoned me started asking how I was, saying I looked amazing, asking what had happened. I answered vaguely. Just making positive changes in my life. Focusing on myself. Discovering that I deserve good things. All those self-help phrases people love. But behind them was a rock-solid truth. I had money. I had power. And soon, everyone would know. A former friend who was still in touch with Patricia called me 3 weeks after my transformation. "Ellen," she said with that barely concealed gossipy tone, "Patricia showed me your photos. She's a little worried. How are you managing to pay for all this? Did you win the lottery or something?" I smiled to myself in my new apartment. "Something like that," I replied. "I just made some good investments. And I'm taking care of myself." It's amazing how life can change when you decide to value yourself. My friend was silent for a moment. "She wants to know if you're okay. If you're mad at her. If you're going to do something." "Do something," I repeated innocently. "Like what?" "I'm just living my best life. If this bothers anyone, that's their problem, not mine." I hung up knowing every word would be repeated to Patricia. And that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted her to start wondering. I wanted the doubt to start gnawing. Because the sweetest revenge isn't about destroying someone outright. It's about making them destroy themselves with their own insecurities and regrets. In the following months, I continued posting on social media. Never anything obvious or vulgar. Just fragments of a clearly comfortable and happy life. A photo at the theater. Dinners at nice restaurants. A weekend in New York staying in a 5-star hotel. A new car, not extravagant, but definitely expensive. A pottery class I started taking just because I'd always wanted to. Each post was a subliminal message. I'm fine. Better than fine. And you're not missed at all. What I didn't know was that Richard and Patricia were having problems. I found out months later from the same gossipy friend. Apparently, their married life wasn't as perfect as they imagined. The money they'd stolen was gone. Richard had lost his new job and was having trouble finding another because word had spread in the industry about his lack of ethics. Patricia was working as a receptionist for minimum wage. They were renting a small apartment in a bad neighborhood. The bills were piling up. Worse, they were fighting constantly. He blamed her for insisting on spending so much money on the wedding. She blamed him for not being able to hold down a decent job. Their fiery passion for each other was quickly cooling under the weight of financial reality. When I heard this, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something deeper. I felt validation. The universe had its own form of justice. But I still wanted my moment. I wanted them to know specifically what they'd lost. So, 6 months after discovering the money, I organized a party. Not a huge event, but an elegant dinner at my apartment for 30 carefully selected guests. Old friends, new neighbors, acquaintances from the Boston social scene. And yes, I made sure the invitation reached Richard and Patricia through mutual acquaintances. I knew they wouldn't come, obviously. But I knew they would hear about the party. They would hear about the apartment. They would hear about the expensive food, the imported wine, the impeccable decor. They would hear how Ellen Thompson, the failed and abandoned woman, was thriving in ways they couldn't even imagine. The party was a success. People were amazed by the apartment, the view, everything. Everyone wanted to know how I'd managed to recover so well. I told an edited version of the truth. My mother had left me an inheritance I didn't know existed. I discovered it at the right time. We invested it wisely. Now I'm rebuilding my life. People loved the story. It was inspiring, a modern-day fairy tale. The broken woman rising from the ashes. No one needed to know the exact details. No one needed to know about the 95 million. They just needed to know I was okay. Better than okay. That I'd won. 2 weeks after the party, I got a message from Patricia. "Hi Ellen," it said. "I hope you're doing well. I saw some pictures of you, and it seems like things have improved for you. I'm happy. Look, I know things ended badly between us, but I'd like to talk. Maybe we can have coffee sometime? Can we put the past behind us?" I knew exactly what it was. She'd heard about the money, or at least suspected something. And now she wanted to get closer. Maybe she thought we could be friends again. Maybe she thought I would share my good fortune with her, as I always had in the past. I left the message unanswered for 3 days. Then, finally, I responded. "Patricia, thank you for getting in touch. But I think it's best that each of you go your own way. I wish you and Richard well. Take care." It was polite, cold, and final. I didn't leave the door open for reconciliation. I didn't offer any explanations. I simply closed that chapter. What I didn't expect was for Richard to seek me out. 3 months later, he showed up at the door of my building. The doorman called me saying there was a Richard Thompson wanting to speak with me. My first instinct was to say he wasn't home. But then I thought maybe this was exactly the moment I'd been waiting for. I went down to the lobby but didn't invite him up. He looked different. Thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, his clothes less tidy. The confident, arrogant man who had left me a year ago seemed diminished. "Ellen," he began, his voice carrying a pleading quality I'd never heard before. "I need to talk to you. About everything. About how things ended. I was wrong." I crossed my arms and waited. He continued, the words coming out fast and nervous. "Patricia and I aren't doing well. In fact, we're terrible. We have no money. I lost my job and can't find another. She's blaming me for everything. And I realized I made a huge mistake. You were always a good wife. You always took care of me. And I threw it all away." I paused before answering. "And why exactly are you telling me this?" He looked at the floor. "I heard you received an inheritance. That things have gotten better for you. And I thought maybe, since we've been married for so many years, you could help me. Just until I get back on my feet. A small loan. 5,000. 10,000 max. I'll pay it back, I swear." I let the silence stretch between us until it became uncomfortable. Richard finally looked me in the eye and must have seen something there that made him take a step back. "Ellen, please. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I'm desperate." I took a deep breath and said in the calmest voice I could muster, "Richard, you took everything I had. You stole my house, put debts in my name, left me with literally nothing. You humiliated me with my best friend. You made me feel like I was nothing, a failure, someone who didn't even deserve basic respect. And now you come here asking for money because you're struggling." He tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "No, let me finish. I spent a year in hell because of you. I worked 2 jobs. I almost ended up homeless. I thought about giving up on life. And all that time, you and Patricia were living the best life possible with money stolen from me, posting happy pictures, without a single regret. Do you really think I'm going to give you a dime?" He blushed. "You don't understand. Patricia is talking about leaving me. She says she can't take it anymore. That I'm not man enough to take care of her." She smiles humorlessly. "Funny how things change when the money runs out, isn't it? I'll give you some free advice, Richard. Learn to clean bathrooms. Pay well. Now get out of my building before I call security." I turned and started walking to the elevator. "Ellen, wait," he shouted. "At least tell me how much you inherited. People are talking. They say you're rich now. Very rich." I turned back one last time. "What I have or don't have is none of your business anymore, Richard. You chose to walk out of my life. Now live with the consequences. I climbed back to my apartment, shaking with adrenaline. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was power. The power to say no. The power to turn away. The power to make it clear he meant nothing to me anymore. It was more satisfying than any elaborate revenge I could have planned. 2 weeks later, I learned through the gossip network that Patricia had indeed left Richard. She had met another man, someone with real money this time, and had jumped into the next relationship without looking back. Richard was living with his mother, 52 years old, with no job, no money, no prospects. The irony was delicious. The man who had left me because I wasn't enough was now more broken than I'd ever been. And Patricia, who had destroyed our friendship for a man and money, had shown her true colors by jumping to the next man with resources as soon as Richard had nothing left to offer. They deserved each other, and now they were reaping exactly what they had sown. As for me, I continued living my life. Not extravagantly or flashily, but comfortably and meaningfully. I began volunteering at shelters for women victims of domestic violence and financial abuse. I used my experience to help other women who were where I had been. I created a private emergency fund to help women in desperate situations start over. I didn't put my name on anything. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted to make a difference. I also traveled. I went to places I'd always dreamed of visiting. Italy, Greece, Japan. I saw the world through new eyes, as a free and independent woman. I made new friendships, true friendships this time, based on honesty and mutual respect. I began writing a book about my experience, not necessarily to publish, but as therapy. And little by little, month after month, I began healing. The wounds didn't disappear completely. There were still nights when I woke up angry, thinking about everything I'd lost, all the time wasted. But those nights became increasingly rare, because I had learned something valuable. My worth wasn't in how much money I had. It wasn't about having a husband or being socially accepted. My worth was in who I was, how I treated people, and my ability to survive and thrive even after being destroyed. Money only gave me the resources to rebuild. But the strength was always within me. A year after that day at the bank, I threw myself a private party. I didn't invite anyone. I just sat on my apartment balcony with a glass of good wine, looking out at the city lights at night. I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal. The pain. The despair. The miraculous discovery. The rebuilding. And I realized that, in a strange, twisted way, I was grateful. Grateful because I had discovered who Richard and Patricia really were before wasting any more time with them. Grateful because I had hit rock bottom and discovered I was strong enough to climb back up. Grateful because I had learned that people are temporary, but our essence is permanent. And yes, grateful for the $95 million that had given me not only financial security but also the freedom to be who I truly was without relying on anyone. I clinked my glass and said aloud to the night, "Here's the woman you thought was nothing. The failure. The rejected one. Look at her now." I didn't need to say anything else. The universe already knew. And somewhere in the city, I imagined Richard and Patricia knew it too, each dealing with the consequences of their choices while I lived free from theirs. Today, 2 years after that transformative day at the bank, my life is unrecognizable compared to what it was. Not just financially, but in every way that truly matters. I have true friends. I have purpose. I have peace. And I've learned that the best revenge isn't hurting the people who hurt you. It's living so well that they become irrelevant. Richard still texts me occasionally, always asking for help, always with apologies. I read them and delete them without responding. Patricia has tried to get back together several times, always with that manipulative way I didn't recognize before but now see clearly. I also ignore them. They are part of my past, closed chapters in a book I've already finished reading. My present and future belong to people who value me, who respect me, and who would never make me question my own worth. And if anyone asks me if I've forgiven Richard and Patricia, my answer is always the same. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or allowing them back into your life. Forgiveness means releasing the anger that binds you to the past. And yes, I have. Not for them, but for me. Because I deserve to live without this burden. If you identified with my story or know someone going through a similar situation, please like and share this video. In the comments, tell me about your experience or simply leave a word of support for those who need to hear it. And subscribe to the channel for more real stories of overcoming adversity like this one. Remember, no matter how dark the night, there's always the possibility of a dawn. You just have to hold on until the light arrives. In my case, the light came in the form of $95 million and a lesson in personal strength that no amount of money could buy. But true wealth was discovering that I was worth much more than anyone had led me to believe. And you are too. Never forget that.